These brilliant masses of threads are sent out by mycorrhizal fungi and create underground networks to distribute nutrients among plants and trees and to deliver immune support when there is a threat present. Their communication demonstrates collaborative intelligence and mutualism. Humans evolved in coexistence with the 2.4 billion year old fungi kingdom, its biomass literally supporting our every footstep and its spores present in our every breath. Western science sent humans to the moon in 1969, but the first empirical study of how these fungal networks actually connect forests wasn't carried out until the 1990s. While space exploration is a significant achievement, how ironic that what's right under our feet can be known or simply ignored. This knowledge, which is really science catching up to what has always been part of indigenous ways of knowing, could show us a path to healing our dying planet home being ravaged by global capitalism. The first principle of our Unitarian Universalist faith affirms and promotes the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We are presently facing multiple existential crises with disproportionate impacts on human life. And as Unitarian Universalists, we are being asked to peel back layers of comfort, to face histories that have been hidden, and to listen to realities that have been silenced by the same systems that are destroying the planet. Our faith calls us into loving transformation of who and how we are in the world, so that we are accountably involved in the collective liberation of every person and being threatened by oppression and violence. Deep transformation of any system will naturally cause an often nonlinear churning of all its parts. And it is here where I believe that underworlds, places we may avoid, both natural and human-created, may reveal themselves and offer lessons fundamental to us as individuals and to our species past, present, and future on this precious earth. Robert McFarlane, the author of Underland, writes that for human beings across cultures and epochs, the underland has been used to shelter what is precious, to yield what is valuable, and to dispose of what is harmful. McFarlane writes richly of entering limestone caves, the catacombs under Paris, a British potash mine containing a dark matter laboratory, an ice crevasse on a Greenland glacier, remote Norwegian sea caves in winter, and a nuclear waste tomb in Finland. All places where human presence has interacted with deep geological time. He describes deep time as the dizzying expanses of Earth history that stretch away from the present moment, measured in units that humble the human instant, epochs and eons. Deep time is kept by stone, ice, stalactites, seabed sediments, and the drift of tectonic plates. It opens into the future as well as the past. How and why have humans interacted with deep time over our species' evolution? Limestone rock, found all over the globe, in hills, caves, sinkholes, cenotes, has been a key portal for our human ancestors and early relatives to access the underland where water carves through millennia. Limestone itself is composed of compressed bodies of ancient marine organisms. This calcium carbonate mineral of deep time is the same from which our teeth and bones derive their strength. Limestone caverns, millions of years old, are the site of human burials and visions, evidenced in art. In fact, an early relative of Homo sapiens, Homo naledi, appear to have buried their dead in a limestone cave in South Africa 300,000 years ago. From our subconscious come ancient myths like Orpheus and Eurydice, which illustrate our psychological connection to the underground as a place of revelation. In his exploration in Slovenian caves, McFarlane chases a disappearing river called the Reka, just as you might recall the river Styx in the underworld in Greek mythology. Humans have been and are intimately connected to deep time in our bodies, our ancestries, and our subconscious. As McFarlane travels, his experiences with the underland of Arctic ice hold particularly haunting warnings for our species. On the Knud Rasmussen Glacier in Greenland, he describes his experience descending into a mulan, a rushing torrent of meltwater that drills into a crevasse on a glacier, picking up speed and power as it flows through time down to the bedrock, where it warms the bedrock, leading to further melting of ancient ice. When measured, the ancient air trapped in this deep ice holds key information about temperature and the content of the atmosphere over eons. This underworld data helps us see that the catastrophic effects of current global heating can be directly traced to human activity through the extraction and overconsumption of underland resources. At the same time that the accelerating ice melt is clearly signaling our future as a species, the warming and melting are also uncovering the past. A recent drought in Britain allowed the land to disclose crop marks, such as ancient Roman towers and Neolithic causeways, never before seen. In Greenland, a former US Cold War military base, and all of its radioactive contents that had been dug into the ice and left under an assumption of permanent weather patterns have now been revealed. And melting Arctic permafrost is also uncovering perfectly preserved life forms at the same time that huge quantities of methane and eradicated diseases such as smallpox are being released. McFarlane's travel stories and reflections are interspersed with scientific support for a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene, so named because of the strata of plastic, city infrastructure, and radioactive material currently forming the future underland of the Earth. A future geologist will study these strata, and the ice core samples will show a huge spike in nitrogen as the chemical sign of our era of fossil fuel burning. What will they learn about our species and our epoch? Your answer to this question may be as grim as mine. As I read McFarlane, I question who the we and the humans are that he refers to. I think of systems of power and who gets to decide what is disposed of in the underland, what is extracted, and who is the most vulnerable to the consequences of these choices. The powers responsible for this haunting new epoch have operated in the form of colonialism and global capitalism, based on an ideology of white supremacy. We entered into the Anthropocene in the nuclear age with increased resource extraction and toxic waste disposal, population growth, carbon emissions, and more. Melting ice is revealing literally and figuratively what those in power have tried to get us to avoid or ignore. And the current geopolitical rise of authoritarian governments, which feed on this toxic ideology of domination and racist violence, are repressing attempts by the majority of the world's citizens to transform our ways of being and return to the collective life-sustaining patterns that our fellow organisms under our feet humbly demonstrate, and which Indigenous groups have often mirrored and are working to reclaim. What is our Unitarian Universalist faith calling us to do at this pivotal moment in the history of our country, our species, and our planet? Many Unitarian Universalists, myself included, have participated in and benefited from systems of power and privilege based on whiteness, with a destructive culture of white supremacy, insidiously affecting our thoughts about ourselves and our interactions with others, and sheltering us from the harsh realities of groups marginalized and harmed by this ideology. Black, brown, and Indigenous people, both in the United States and in the global South, face severe inequities from the violence and suffering resulting from the climate crisis and other issues. So, to begin, our Unitarian Universalist Association has been centering the previously silenced voices of those in our faith and in our society that are the most impacted by power structures based in white supremacy. They are listening to stories of the harm Black, Indigenous, and people of color have faced in our UU congregations, and are providing specific guidance for change in the association and congregations. They are also following the lead of grassroots organizers in marginalized communities to guide our faith's action on our values. The UUA has demonstrated humility in taking an uncomfortable look at the complex underland of our UU history and ancestors, holding multiple truths and complexity about our history, and in looking how our current practices can and should change based on a sense of responsibility for the present without condemning our past. Our denomination has approved statements of conscience to dismantle white supremacy, end settler colonialism on Indigenous land, defund the violent, militarized policing system, fight voter suppression, and many other areas where we see our UU values violated. So what does this mean for an individual Unitarian Universalist and or a congregation? How do we enter into this uncomfortable underland of our histories that have a direct bearing on our present existential crises? Our denomination not only serves as a mirror for the process they hope we engage in, but also provides faith resources and programs for us to learn and grow from. I want to specifically share my experience in an anti-racist faith development course called Beloved Conversations, in which participants explore the effects of white supremacy within ourselves. Can I just tell you, several years ago, that term white supremacy, I remember I was sitting by the Chattahoochee River with beloved former Emerson member Tina Graff. She brought up this term, white supremacy. I felt myself cringing, saying, why does it have to be this term? She said that the naming of it was very important in order to dismantle it. At that time, she was starting to peer into the underland of whiteness, but I didn't understand yet. Several months ago, Tina and I had a Zoom conversation after both of us had participated in similar courses. And we shared that we had both thought we were just good white liberals, but that our new awareness had challenged that. My question now is whether I'm being a good ancestor. So what have I started learning? I've been learning about the underland of my ancestors. There's so many things that have been hidden to me. I don't know about you, my fellow white people, but my emotional and spiritual ties to my Northern European ancestors and their migrating descendants is almost non-existent once I get past my great-grandparents. In almost all cultures and traditions around the world, there are practices of gratitude and prayer to ancestors and sacred places connected to ancestors. It's as if I'm rootless and unattached to something fundamentally important to a human being. Yet, I do have ancestors, English, German, Scots-Irish, whose choices, sacrifices, actions, and generosity are part of my inheritance. I've come to learn that there was an intentional severing of their connection to their cultural identity and ancestral European land. An emptiness that also seems to be part of my inheritance. In discovering more about my ancestors, I've been guided to approach them first with compassion in order to be able to hold multiple truths about them. In her book, An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, published by our own UU Beacon Press, Roxanne Dunbar traces the origins of church-sanctioned European colonialism to the beginnings of private property and capitalist production in the 1500s and 1600s, when English peasants were evicted from their common land so that the wealthy could use the land to raise sheep for wool export. These English peasants were displaced to the cities and were criminalized for returning to the commons and for continuing to practice their pre-Christian matrilineal ways of being and living in relationship to the land and each other, with witch trials prevalent at this time. These landless, poor peasants then were available as settlers for the colonized lands of North America. Those are my English ancestors who were used to carry out brutal acts as this country was being settled. But what about my Scotch-Irish ancestors of Pennsylvania that I've always felt proud of in this foggy nostalgia for my roots? So again, this system of colonization and white supremacy, with its practices of dehumanization and genocide, needed these Scotch-Irish settlers to help settle land. Dunbar Ortiz relates that in their colonization of Ireland in the 1600s, the British strategically used Protestant Scots as settlers of Irish lands in Ulster, slaughtering and scalping the indigenous Irish as they resisted this land grab. She writes that the Scots-Irish settlers in North America were then used as part of frontier-ranging militias that cleared areas for settlement by exterminating indigenous farmers and destroying their towns. So what about my German ancestors who came after the Civil War to Memphis, Tennessee? These are my maternal ancestors I know the most about. I learned about my seemingly bohemian great-great-aunt Ida, who, like me, had no children and loved to travel, leaving a travel journal from her adventures in Europe after World War I for me to just pore through. Is she complicit in this violent system of white supremacy? I don't know. What I do know is that she was living in Memphis, Tennessee during the Jim Crow era. I remember learning last summer that even families with children, that lynchings of Black people were a spectacle, a festival time for white people. That even families with children attended these violent executions, taking photographs of themselves, smiling next to a hanging body. Can I hold the multiple truths, complexities of my ancestors? My UU faith is helping me understand that I can, and that I can hold multiple truths about myself in my own complexity. By opening myself to the possibility that my ancestors' violence and dehumanization is part of the soil I stand in, I make space for holding the multiple truths of who they were and who I am. I can realize that I, as their descendant, can do things differently. To understand their actions and choices, I can remember that their ancestors were traumatically displaced from their land in Europe. I can use this awareness to inform a collective responsibility for challenging systems of oppression and hope that my imperfect actions will have made me a good ancestor in the eyes of my descendants. It's going to be very messy, uncomfortable work, digging around in the underlands of what it means to be white in the United States, along with the recognition that white supremacy culture is the force that underlies all of our current crises. Yet, if we can humbly allow the sometimes sobering, sometimes awe-inspiring lessons of the underlands to be our guide toward resilience, we can organize ourselves collectively to sustain life, as the brilliant, resilient mycelium below us have been doing for a couple of billion years. McFarlane believes that lessons from deep time urge us to action. He writes that when viewed in deep time, things come alive that seemed inert. New responsibilities reveal themselves. Ice breathes. Rock has tides. Mountains ebb and flow. Stone pulses. We live on a restless earth. People in affected communities are already organizing their movement work in decentralized and nonlinear ways that are mirrored in the natural world. As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to listen and follow their lead through deeply rooted partnerships as part of a collaborative intelligence that moves us toward collective liberation, where our first principle is both a statement of moral value and a call for action.